Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? The storm had begun in the late afternoon, gathering itself over the countryside with the sort of determination one associates with quarrelsome dowagers who will not be contradicted. By early evening it had broken with fury, lashing the narrow lanes and beating against windows with a violence that set even the most solid panes rattling in their frames. In their modest Chelsea sitting-room, Tommy Beresford leaned back in his chair, pipe clenched at an angle that suggested resignation rather than contentment. "It's a filthy night," he remarked, as another gust pressed rain hard against the glass. "Filthy enough, Tuppence, to make even burglars abandon their trade." Tuppence, curled in the opposite armchair, was quite unperturbed. A brightly coloured knitting project lay across her lap, though truth be told she had not advanced beyond the first 2 rows. Her eyes, lively and mischievous, followed the lightning that lit the room in dazzling fits and starts. "Nonsense," she said. "Burglars, dear boy, are no respecters of meteorology. In fact, if I were of the criminal persuasion, I should choose just such a night as this. No one abroad, and the storm to cover any inconvenient noises. Very convenient all round." Tommy grunted, though with amusement. He was long accustomed to Tuppence's cheerfulness in adversity, be it tempest or intrigue. At that precise moment came a sound above the storm, the sharp knock of the letter flap in the front door. Both looked up in surprise. "No one would deliver post at this hour," Tommy said, setting his pipe aside. "It's gone 7. "Unless it's a love letter," Tuppence replied instantly. "Secret assignations know no timetable." Tommy rose, muttering something about the unreliability of women, and went to the door. He returned a moment later with an envelope in his hand, droplets clinging to its heavy cream surface. "This," he announced, "was pushed under the door just now. No knock, no ring, and the postman was long finished." Tuppence sat up eagerly, abandoning her knitting. "Show me." She took the envelope, which was unusually thick, sealed with dark red wax, and impressed with a crest. The image was peculiar, a raven perched upon what appeared to be a sheet of glass, cracked down the middle. The impression was faint, as though the seal had not been used in many years. "How perfectly thrilling," Tuppence breathed. "A raven on glass. One imagines sinister omens. Rather better than the usual electricity bills, don't you think?" Tommy watched her with mock severity. "If this turns out to be merely an advertisement for patent medicine, I shall be sorely disappointed." She broke the seal with relish and unfolded the letter. The paper itself was aged but fine, the ink slightly faded yet legible in an elegant hand. "To Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, I beg you will forgive this intrusion. Matters of urgent discretion compel me to request your presence at Greyhaven Hall with all speed. Your particular talents are known to me, and I assure you the need is grave. I shall expect you tomorrow evening. Do not fail me. Eleanor Harwood." Tuppence read it aloud, her voice lingering with delight on the phrases urgent discretion and do not fail me. "Well," she said, eyes shining, "that's an invitation if ever I heard one. Particular talents. She must have heard of us." Tommy was less sanguine. He took the letter, scanning it carefully. No address beyond Greyhaven Hall. That suggests we're supposed to know it, which we don't. "I dare say we can find out," Tuppence said. "Greyhaven Hall. It sounds exactly like the sort of place where dreadful secrets lurk in the attics, and ladies faint in corridors." Tommy folded the letter thoughtfully. "What do you make of it, old thing? Hoax or genuine distress?" Tuppence leaned back, considering. "Distress, certainly. No woman writes 'do not fail me' unless she is desperate. As for hoax, well, we've had enough of those in our time. But something tells me this is no prank. There's a sort of shiver about it." The thunder rolled heavily overhead, as though to underscore her words. At that moment came another knock, more ordinary, upon the door. Tommy opened it to reveal the local postman, soaked to the skin, delivering the last of his route. "You didn't just push this under our door, did you?" Tommy asked, holding up the strange envelope. The man shook his head vigorously. "Not me, sir. Finished your post hours back. Haven't seen an envelope like that in all my days." Tommy thanked him and shut the door. He looked at Tuppence. So someone came right up to the door in this storm and slipped it inside. Delicious, Tuppence declared. We must go. If we refused invitations merely because they arrived in a suspicious fashion, life would be intolerably dull. Tommy sighed, though the gleam in his eyes betrayed anticipation. Very well. Tomorrow evening, Greyhaven Hall, wherever it is. Precisely, Tuppence said. She resumed her knitting with exaggerated calm, though her thoughts were plainly racing ahead. I shall wear my blue coat. It always impresses nervous hostesses. Tommy laughed, the tension broken for the moment. Yet the letter lay between them on the table, its strange crest catching the light of the fire, promising mystery to come. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the room a different storm had begun, one of questions, shadows, and the certainty that the Beresfords' comfortable domesticity was about to be shattered once again. The rain had not entirely exhausted itself by the following evening, though its violence had dwindled to a steady drizzle that wrapped the countryside in mist. As the Beresfords' hired motor car wound its way along the long drive to Greyhaven Hall, the headlights cut narrow tunnels through the fog. Tuppence pressed her nose against the glass, peering out with the enthusiasm of a schoolgirl arriving at a holiday adventure. There it is, Tommy, she whispered. Exactly as I imagined. Turrets, chimneys, a drive that seems to go on forever. You can almost hear the family skeletons rattling about. Tommy, hunched beside her, adjusted his hat. Family skeletons I can tolerate, but the roof looks like it might fall in on us. Place could do with a bit of modern paint and central heating. The car drew up at the main entrance, an arch of ancient stone that dripped steadily in the rain. Above, the house loomed, tall, irregular, and forbidding. Glass glimmered faintly in the wings to either side, vast conservatories stretching out like the wings of a monstrous bird. A liveried servant, stiff in spite of the weather, stepped forward with an umbrella. Greyhaven Hall, sir. Lady Eleanor awaits you. They were ushered into a cavernous hall where a fire struggled against the draughts that whistled through the beams. Shadows leapt uneasily along the panelled walls. At the top of the stairs descended Lady Eleanor Harwood. She was tall, elegant in a faded way, and her hand trembled slightly as she extended it. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, she said in a voice soft and wavering, I cannot tell you what a relief it is that you have come. You received my letter? We did, said Tommy. A curious business, if I may say so. Delivered under our door in the middle of a storm. I take it you sent it by hand? Lady Eleanor's eyes darted nervously toward the shadows. I entrusted it to a messenger. She did not elaborate, and Tommy, catching Tuppence's glance, decided not to press her. Not yet. You must forgive the strangeness of it all, Lady Eleanor went on. My late husband, Sir Reginald, he was a collector of rather singular objects. Mirrors, glass, artefacts of a curious kind. Since his death there have been disturbances, unwanted attention. I feared matters might turn dangerous. She led them into the drawing-room, a long chamber lit by sconces and a great chandelier of cut glass that shivered with the draught. Here the family were gathered, a small but varied assembly. Allow me, Lady Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of introductions. My husband's nephews, Charles and Henry, my cousin Clara, and Mrs. Jessup, our housekeeper. Another relative, my cousin Ambrose, is expected tomorrow. He was close to Reginald in his studies and has long been preoccupied with glass. You will meet him soon enough. Charles was tall, with an air of bored confidence. He raised his eyebrows as if the very idea of detectives amused him. Henry, slighter and more restless, gave a quick, nervous bow. Clara, pale and serious, smiled faintly but said nothing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Jessup, inclined her head in the manner of one who disapproved of the entire business, yet could not forbid it. Tuppence took it all in with quick, darting glances. Her eye was drawn almost at once to a cabinet at the far side of the room, tall, glass-fronted, with an elaborate lock gleaming in the firelight. Inside, arranged with almost ritual precision, were mirrors of every shape and size. On one gilt frame, Tuppence noticed faint scratches near the edge, like marks of something pressed or pried there long ago. She filed it away with curiosity, but said nothing. Hand mirrors, oval mirrors, tall gilt mirrors, each reflecting the light in peculiar shifting ways. "How very singular," she murmured. Lady Eleanor caught the remark. Reginald believed glass held secrets, that it could capture things unseen. He had the conservatories built for his experiments, though I never pretended to understand them. Tommy, practical as ever, said, "You think someone covets the collection?" A shadow passed across Lady Eleanor's face. "Yes, and more than covet. Twice already someone has attempted the cabinet lock. I have heard footsteps at night, and Clara swears she saw shadows moving in the mirrors themselves." Clara spoke for the first time. Her voice was low, with a faint tremor. "It was not imagination. I saw it. The glass darkened as though someone were behind it, though the room was empty." A silence followed, filled only by the crackling of the fire. "Superstition," said Charles abruptly. "We're all on edge because of Uncle's death. You'll forgive me, Lady Eleanor, but bringing in private detectives seems a little melodramatic." His tone implied that melodrama was something he disdained unless produced for his personal amusement. "Nevertheless," Lady Eleanor replied with sudden firmness, "I have brought them. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford will remain here until this matter is settled." Tuppence smiled sweetly at Charles as if daring him to object further. He did not, though his jaw tightened. They were shown to their rooms, long, draughty corridors with carpets worn thin by generations. Tuppence's chamber overlooked the conservatories, which gleamed faintly through the mist, panes of glass catching the last light like cold water. She lingered at the window, thoughtful. Later, at dinner, the atmosphere proved no warmer. Conversation stumbled. Henry spilled his wine and laughed too loudly. Charles inquired after the Beresfords' line of work with a lift of the eyebrow that made it clear he doubted any of it was respectable. Mrs. Jessup hovered like a gaunt spectre, her disapproval manifest in every clink of the dishes she set down. Only Clara seemed willing to engage, asking quiet questions about London and society. In the middle of the meal, thunder rolled again, though no storm was forecast. The chandelier quivered, and in the glass panels along the wall Tommy thought he saw movement. A trick of reflection, no doubt, but enough to make him narrow his eyes. When the ladies had withdrawn, Tommy found himself cornered by Charles, who spoke in a low, sardonic voice. "You'll find nothing here, Mr. Beresford, except boredom and family squabbles. My aunt indulges in fantasies. I'd advise you to collect your fee and leave before you're swallowed by them." "Sound advice," Tommy said mildly, "but I've always been a poor listener." Charles gave him a long look, then shrugged and turned away. Upstairs, later, Tommy and Tuppence met in the corridor before retiring. "Well?" Tuppence whispered. "Well," Tommy repeated. "A nervous lady, 2 quarrelsome nephews, a pale cousin, and a housekeeper who would hang us all if given leave. Not to mention a cabinet of glass that looks like the front row at a séance." "And shadows that move," Tuppence added. "Shadows," Tommy said, "have a way of moving when people are nervous enough to expect them." "Perhaps," she said, but her eyes, bright with mischief and curiosity, strayed back toward the drawing-room door. "Still, Tommy, I think Greyhaven promises to be very far from dull." The corridor was cold, the lamps flickering. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 11, and the sound echoed through the halls like the tolling of a warning bell. On the following evening, dinner at Greyhaven Hall was conducted with all the outward forms of civility, but beneath the glitter of crystal and the gleam of polished silver ran a current sharp enough to cut. The long oak table, scarred by centuries of service, bore a meal that should have inspired comfort: roast pheasant, potatoes crisped and dripping, rich wine decanted into heavy glasses. Yet conversation soon soured, like milk turned in the heat. Lady Eleanor, pale and fluttering, attempted to maintain the atmosphere of a gracious hostess. "It is good of you all to gather," she said, her hands tightening upon her napkin. "Reginald always said family unity was the foundation of strength." Charles gave a dry laugh. "Unity, Aunt. It is a fine word, but one that seems to have slipped from our family vocabulary the moment the will was read." Henry flushed. "You always think in terms of money, Charles. Not everything is about shares and percentages." "No?" Charles's eyebrow arched. "And your creditors agree, do they? I hear the mess from your regiment follows you still. Debts are difficult companions." The soldier cousin's jaw clenched, his hands tightening on his cutlery until the knife grated against the plate. Clara interjected softly, her voice striving for peace. "Please, must we quarrel in front of Lady Eleanor? Uncle's memory deserves better." For the briefest instant, her eyes flicked toward Charles with something sharper than sorrow, a flash of bitterness quickly veiled beneath composure. Lady Eleanor looked as though she might weep at the word memory, but Charles only leaned back with the languid insolence of one who thrives upon discomfort. "I merely state what is obvious," he said. "We sit here like vultures circling over what Reginald left behind. If not coin, then trinkets. If not trinkets, then glass baubles." His gaze flicked deliberately toward the cabinet in the adjoining hall. It was the mention of that cabinet, Tommy later thought, that brought the silence down like a guillotine. Every face turned, consciously or not, toward that collection of mirrors and glass. Even Mrs. Jessup, the housekeeper, who had hovered at the side with the disapproval of a parish belle, allowed her lips to thin further. Tuppence, sitting straight-backed with deceptive composure, tilted her head toward Tommy. "Baubles, he calls them. I'd wager my best hat they're rather more than that." Before Tommy could reply, a sound split the air, sharp, resonant, violent. A crash, glass exploding, the diners froze, cutlery suspended. Then chairs scraped back in a chorus of alarm as the family rose almost as one. The noise had come from the hall. They rushed through the archway to find one of the great Venetian mirrors, a tall, gilded thing that had hung above the staircase for centuries, lying in ruin upon the stone floor. Shards glittered everywhere, catching the candlelight in jagged splinters. The gilt frame sprawled like a fallen corpse. Lady Eleanor gave a faint cry and collapsed against Clara, who barely managed to hold her. "The curse," she whispered. "Oh, merciful heavens, the curse begins." Tuppence bent swiftly to the wreckage, her eyes sharp. She did not touch the pieces, but noted the distribution with keen interest. "Tommy," she murmured, "look, there's a shard missing." Indeed, though the floor was strewn with fragments large and small, there was a curious absence. A section of glass that should have been there was nowhere to be seen. "Deliberate?" Tommy asked under his breath. "Deliberate," Tuppence replied. Her eyes glimmered with the spark that came only when mystery beckoned. At that moment, Henry pointed with a trembling finger. Boot prints there, in the dust by the staircase. They all bent to see. Muddy impressions marked the floor, large and distinct, leading away from the wreckage and across the hall. Yet halfway to the conservatory doors they vanished, as though the walker had stepped into air. "Vanished," Clara gasped. Charles gave a short, derisive laugh. "Vanished into the mist, perhaps, but hardly into thin air. One of us tracked mud in. Let us not conjure spectres." But his bravado rang thinly. Lady Eleanor, revived with the help of brandy pressed upon her by Mrs. Jessup, insisted upon retiring. "I cannot, not tonight. The sight of Reginald's treasures destroyed. It is too much." Clara supported her up the staircase, leaving the others in uneasy silence. Tommy straightened, his soldier's practicality asserting itself. "Well, a broken mirror in a house of glass is hardly evidence of the supernatural. Someone wanted that mirror destroyed." "Or wanted us to think it fell," Tuppence said. She gestured toward the frame. "Notice how it landed. Not forward from the wall, but as if pushed sideways. And the lock on the cabinet." She left the implication hanging. Charles smirked. "You see conspiracies where none exist, Mrs. Beresford. Old glass breaks, that is all." But his eyes avoided the wreckage, and Tommy marked it. When the hall had quieted, the servants swept up the shards under Mrs. Jessup's stern command. Yet Tommy noticed she too glanced nervously toward the conservatory doors, as though fearing what lay beyond. Later that night, in the privacy of their chamber, Tuppence sat brushing her hair, her reflection fractured in the small dressing-table mirror. "Well?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes thoughtful. Tommy, pacing, said, "Too many threads already. Charles plays the cynic, but he watched that mirror as though it might accuse him. Henry has debts enough for motive. Clara is too pale, too quiet, hiding something. And Lady Eleanor, she believes in curses, or wants us to believe." "And the missing shard," Tuppence reminded him. "Never forget that. Whoever took it has some plan in mind. A shard of glass is not pocketed by accident." "Nor are footprints made to vanish unless the maker knew the ground well," Tommy added. someone familiar with the conservatories. The storm outside had abated, but the night within Greyhaven Hall was darker than ever. The broken mirror seemed to hang in the silence still, its absence echoing more loudly than its presence had. In the days to come, Tommy and Tuppence would remember this night as the moment when the household's fragile composure shattered along with the glass, revealing in jagged pieces the secrets beneath. Morning arrived at Greyhaven Hall reluctantly, as though the mist itself had decided to linger in sympathy with the house's gloom. Pale light filtered through high windows, revealing corridors that seemed too long, doors that seemed too many, and shadows that clung where they had no right to remain. Tommy, who had been trained by long habit to wake early, descended the staircase with soldierly efficiency, intending to secure a cup of tea before the household roused. But he had not gone 10 paces into the lower hall when the silence of the house was rent by a scream, a woman's scream, high, sharp, and filled with horror. Within moments, doors opened above, voices echoed down the stairs, and the family poured into the hall in various states of disarray. Clara, pale as alabaster, clutched the banister, her lips trembling. "It came from the conservatory," she whispered. Tommy was already striding toward the glass double doors at the far end. Tuppence, quick and composed even in her dressing gown, fell into step beside him. "If this is another mirror broken, Tommy, I shall lose patience with our hostess's collection." But when they reached the conservatory, the sight that met them was far more terrible than shattered glass alone. Major Henry Harwood lay sprawled upon the tiled floor, his body twisted grotesquely against the remains of a shattered glass display case. Slivers glistened around him like cruel jewels. One jagged shard protruded from his throat, the blood spreading in a dark pool that looked almost black in the morning light. For a moment, the household stood frozen. Then Lady Eleanor gave a strangled cry and collapsed once again into Clara's arms. "Murder," someone whispered. Tommy crouched swiftly beside the body, his face set in grim lines. "No accident," he said quietly to Tuppence. "He didn't stumble into this, not with that wound." Tuppence's sharp eyes roved the scene. She noted the position of the body, the unnatural angle of the head, the shard lodged too precisely. It was not the clumsy injury of a fall. It was placement, deliberate, cruel. The conservatory itself was heavy with damp air and the scent of earth. Exotic plants pressed against the glass walls, their leaves dripping with condensation. Rows of orchids, lilies, and palms seemed to watch silently as though they too had witnessed the crime. Charles broke the silence with a bark of bitter laughter. "So the curse claims its first victim. You see, Aunt, Reginald's toys bring nothing but death." Mrs. Jessup crossed herself, her face pale but resolute. "Best call the police before the devil takes another." By noon, Inspector Graves had arrived from the local constabulary, a tall, broad man with an expression that managed to convey both scepticism and a sort of weary patience. He wore a raincoat too long for him, and his hat appeared perpetually damp. "Well, well," he said upon entering, eyeing the Beresfords with mild amusement. "I was told there'd been trouble. Didn't expect to find amateurs already on the job." Tommy straightened. "Not amateurs, Inspector. We were invited by Lady Eleanor herself." Graves scratched his chin. "I've heard of you. Played at detection in town, haven't you? Well, we'll see if your games help us here." Tuppence, undaunted, smiled sweetly. "We've found games to be more useful than you might think, Inspector. Chess, for instance. Move one wrong pawn and your whole strategy collapses. Murder is not so very different." Graves gave a grunt that might have been laughter, or simply irritation. The body had already been left in situ, pending his arrival. Together they examined it. Graves frowned down at the wound. "Could be a fall," he said. "Man trips, crashes into the case, and the glass does the rest." "Could be," Tommy replied evenly. "But the glass embedded in his throat. Too clean, too precise. And look at the angle of the blood spatter. Not a stumble, a push." Tuppence bent near the case, her keen gaze sweeping the floor. "And here's something stranger." She reached with a pencil and nudged a glove from beneath a chair. It was stained with blood, a right-hand glove, leather, expensive. "Belonged to the deceased?" Graves asked. "Possibly," Tuppence said, though doubt coloured her tone. "But notice where it lies. Not near him. Tucked neatly under this chair. Almost too neat." "Planted?" Tommy suggested. "Precisely," Tommy added dryly. or planted. Too neat by half. No one leaves a glove tucked under a chair unless they want it found. The inspector frowned. You two are determined to complicate matters. A glove's a glove. Could have been dropped. Of course, Tuppence agreed lightly, yet I cannot help wondering who wished us to notice it. Meanwhile, the household gathered uneasily in the drawing-room. Graves called them in one by one, taking statements with the patience of a farmer sorting obstinate cattle. Charles was brusque. Henry drank too much, gambled too much and owed half the county. If you're looking for enemies, start with his creditors. Clara trembled as she spoke. He was quarrelsome, yes, but not wicked. He was troubled. Last night he came to me speaking of debts and disgrace. I tried to calm him. I never dreamed. Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Mrs. Jessop's testimony was blunt. I warned Lady Eleanor no good would come of that cabinet of mirrors. Strange goings-on at night, shadows where there should be none, now blood on the floor. That's the truth of it. Lady Eleanor herself could hardly speak, her grief and terror combining into incoherence. The curse, she whispered again and again. Reginald's curse. Graves rolled his eyes privately, but Tuppence noted how Clara pressed a glass of water into Lady Eleanor's hand with the devotion of a companion who knew more than she said. When the interviews were done, Tommy and Tuppence lingered in the conservatory once more. The plants rustled faintly as if stirred by some unseen hand. "What do you make of it?" Tommy asked, his voice low. "That glove is the thing," Tuppence said, "placed like bait. And Henry's debts, they give half the house motive. Charles sneers too much. Clara weeps too perfectly. And our dear housekeeper? She watches all with eyes like gimlets." Tommy smiled grimly. "So, everyone is a suspect." "Exactly as it should be," Tuppence replied. Her eyes caught the fractured reflection in a shard of glass still embedded in the frame. The jagged surface seemed to multiply her image, a dozen Tuppences staring back. "You see, Tommy, here nothing appears as it truly is. Reflections distort, and someone here knows how to use distortion as a weapon." As they left the conservatory, the broken case still glittering like a wound, the mist outside pressed close against the glass. It seemed to Tommy that the house itself held its breath, waiting for the next fracture, the next fall, the next terrible echo of shattering glass. The first death had come. Others, he felt with a cold certainty, would follow. Greyhaven Hall never seemed darker than it did that night. The day's horror, the sight of Major Harwood's body sprawled upon the tiles of the conservatory, his throat pierced by glittering glass, still lingered in every shadow and echo of the house. Yet evening had come regardless, draping the rooms in velvet gloom. The servants lit candles in tall holders, their wavering flames throwing long silhouettes across the walls. The electricity had faltered again, and Lady Eleanor declared it best to rely upon the old ways. Tommy and Tuppence, fortified by a hastily taken supper, had agreed between themselves that the evening must not be wasted. Murder was a creature that thrived in silence and darkness. It was best met head-on. So they began their quiet round of interviews, weaving their way from room to room under the flickering light of candles. Their first encounter was with Ambrose Harwood, a cousin of Reginald's, who had arrived earlier that afternoon and immediately distinguished himself by carrying a portfolio of notes and speaking with the breathless fervour of a man intoxicated by his own theories. Ambrose stood in the library, hunched over a great folio spread across the desk, the candlelight illuminating his sharp cheekbones and the glint of spectacles. "You see, Mr. Beresford," he said, voice quick, "glass is not merely matter, it is memory. Every surface retains the image of what it has seen, if only we could learn the means to read it. Reginald believed this, and so do I." Tuppence arched an eyebrow. "Mirrors as notebooks, that's a new kind of diary." Ambrose ignored the jest. "The ancients spoke of mirror worlds, reflections that revealed truth. Why else do you think Reginald collected them? Not vanity, no, science." Tommy leaned against the mantel, studying him. "You mean to suggest the mirrors could show us the murderer?" Ambrose's eyes gleamed feverishly. "Perhaps, if we knew how to look." Tuppence caught Tommy's glance, part humour, part unease. A man who believed so strongly in reflections might also believe in bending truth to his own shape. In the servants' hall, Mrs. Jessop polished a set of candlesticks with grim determination, as though polishing away the memory of the day. She did not rise when the Beresfords entered. "Murder under this roof," she said flatly before they could speak. "Mark me, it comes of debts and dishonour. That Major, God rest him, was drowning in it." "Debts?" Tommy asked. "Aye, cards, wagers, foolishness. I heard him quarrelling with Charles more than once. Money owed, threats made. A proud family, but rotting from the inside." Her gnarled hands never stopped moving as she spoke, the candlelight glinting off silver as if in mockery. Tuppence tried to catch her eye, but Mrs. Jessup kept them fixed upon her task. "And you, Mrs. Jessup, what do you believe of Lady Eleanor's notion of curses?" The housekeeper snorted. "Curses are excuses. Men kill for money, for power, for love. Glass may break, but it's hearts and purses that drive murder." Her words lingered as they left her there in the shadows. Later, they found Lady Eleanor seated in the drawing-room before a bank of candles, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Clara hovered nearby, silent as a shadow, her face pale and watchful. Lady Eleanor lifted her head as they approached. "You must not let them take the mirrors," she said with sudden fervour. "Whatever else happens, promise me that. They belong here. Reginald's life's work. They must never leave Greyhaven." Tuppence knelt beside her chair. "Why, Lady Eleanor, surely they're only objects." "No," Lady Eleanor whispered. Her eyes shone fever-bright. "They hold his soul, his genius. Without them, Greyhaven is only stone and timber. With them, it breathes." Clara touched her aunt's shoulder, murmuring something soothing, but Tuppence had already marked the desperation in Lady Eleanor's voice, the desperation of a woman clinging to symbols because truth was too heavy to bear. As the evening deepened, Tommy went in search of Charles. He found him in the passage outside the butler's pantry, speaking in low tones to one of the footmen. "You'll be paid, man," Charles was saying. "Just keep your tongue where it belongs." The servant muttered assent and slipped away hastily at Tommy's approach. Charles turned, his face hardening. "Spying, Beresford?" "Not spying," Tommy said easily. "Merely walking in the wrong corridor at the right time." Charles's smile was tight. "Servants gossip. I prefer to discourage them." "Discouragement can be expensive," Tommy said, "almost as expensive as debts." For a moment their eyes locked, and Tommy saw in the young man's gaze a flash of panic, quickly masked by arrogance. Then Charles shrugged, laughed, and strode away. But Tommy had no doubt. Charles was hiding something, and paying dearly to keep it hidden. Meanwhile, Tuppence had taken it upon herself to explore the long gallery where many of the mirrors hung. Alone but unafraid, she moved with a candle in hand, its flame trembling as though nervous of the reflections it cast. Her steps echoed softly on the parquet floor. The mirrors loomed around her, tall cheval glasses, gilt-framed Venetian pieces, dark ovals that seemed to drink in the light. One in particular drew her, the tallest mirror stretching nearly from floor to ceiling. Its frame was heavy with carved cherubs, its glass clouded with age. She paused, examining it closely. Something about the frame seemed odd, a seam, barely visible, running along the side. With nimble fingers she pressed, and to her delight a panel slid back with a faint click. Inside lay a narrow compartment. Dust swirled as she drew out a bundle of papers, yellowed and brittle with age, letters tied with faded ribbon. She opened one carefully, the ink spidery and faint. "Betrayal cannot be forgiven. Through the glass darkly we shall see truth, but by then it will be too late. Guard yourself, for enemies walk in familiar guise." Tuppence frowned, the words prickling at her like cold wind. Betrayal. Enemies. Glass darkly. Quick footsteps sounded in the corridor, and she swiftly concealed the letters again, retying the ribbon with practised speed. Whoever had written those words had left behind a warning, or perhaps a confession. Later, Tommy and Tuppence reconvened in their chamber, candlelight flickering against the walls. Tommy reported what he had seen, Charles bribing the servant, Ambrose raving about mirror worlds, Mrs. Jessup muttering about debts. Tuppence shared her discovery in the gallery. Letters, Tommy, hidden behind a mirror, and in them references to betrayal to enemies, and the phrase we keep hearing, "through the glass, darkly." Tommy paced, his hands behind his back. So every one of them has motive, means, or madness. Ambrose with his obsessions, Charles with his debts, Henry now dead and perhaps silenced, Lady Eleanor desperate to cling to her mirrors, Clara quiet but always near, Mrs. Jessup listening at doors. "And the letters," Tuppence said softly. "They tie it together somehow. But whose hand wrote them? And why hide them in a mirror?" Tommy stopped pacing, his gaze fixed on her. "Because mirrors distort, Tuppence. They show us something and hide the rest. And here in Greyhaven, everyone hides something." She smiled faintly, though the expression was tinged with unease. "Then we must look harder, Tommy, even if it means staring into glass, until we see what others have missed." The candle between them flickered, casting their twin reflections against the mirror on the far wall. But in that shifting light, it seemed for an instant that another face lingered there too. A trick, perhaps, or something more. Greyhaven Hall slept uneasily that night, its corridors alive with whispers and footsteps that might have been real or imagined. But in the minds of Tommy and Tuppence, one thing was certain. Every suspect had acquired motive. Each face in the candlelight told a different story, yet none of them fit together cleanly. And behind it all, like a refrain whispered through glass, lay the words of the hidden letters, betrayal, enemies, through the glass darkly. The mystery had deepened, the danger had sharpened, and the Beresfords knew that in such a house, candlelight revealed as much as it concealed. The following morning dawned grey and listless, a sky of pewter hanging low over Greyhaven Hall. The storm had passed, but the air carried a heaviness as though the house itself resisted illumination. Tommy and Tuppence breakfasted in a silence broken only by the distant tick of the grandfather clock. Even Lady Eleanor did not appear. Her maid reported she was indisposed. When the servants cleared away the last of the dishes, Tuppence rose. "I want another look at that mirror," she said, "the one that shattered." Tommy nodded, pushing back his chair. "And I'll see if Ambrose can be persuaded to talk sense about his mirror worlds. The fellow's hiding something under all that scholarly claptrap." The hall where the Venetian mirror had fallen still bore traces of the accident, or the crime. The servants had swept away the shards, but faint glitters of glass remained in the cracks of the stone floor, catching the light like tiny watchful eyes. Tuppence knelt, examining the gilded frame that leaned against the wall. Her fingertips hovered near the jagged edges. She recalled the pattern of the shards from the night before, and the one conspicuous absence, a missing triangular piece. She slipped her hand into her pocket and drew it out. The shard had been found at dawn in a forgotten corner of the corridor, and she had kept it quietly, away from Graves's gaze. Now, holding it up, she moved toward another mirror still hanging on the opposite wall. She aligned the shard against its surface. To her astonishment, the glass bent the reflection strangely, doubling it, twisting it, revealing a hidden inscription etched faintly at the mirror's edge, letters invisible until seen through the shard. "Well," Tommy asked, impatience cutting through, "don't keep me staring at glass while you commune with ghosts." "Extraordinary," she breathed. The words were Latin, half obscured, but she caught fragments. Speculum, veritas, per umbras, mirror, truth, through shadows. Tuppence's heart quickened. Someone in this house understood glass far better than mere decoration. She found Ambrose in the library, poring over yet another sheaf of notes. His hair was untidy, his eyes bloodshot, but his fingers danced across the pages with excitement. "Mr. Harwood," Tuppence said lightly, seating herself opposite him, "you know a great deal about glass." Ambrose glanced up sharply. "It is my field." "Enough," Tuppence continued smoothly, "to know how to etch inscriptions invisible to the naked eye, or to use a shard to refract light and reveal secrets." He blanched, then covered it with a laugh too quick. "You've been experimenting, Mrs. Beresford. Admirable curiosity. Yes, I've dabbled in optical forgeries, in recreating lost texts. Glass preserves what parchment cannot." Tommy entered just in time to catch this. "Forgeries, eh? That's a lucrative line, especially if one has debts." Ambrose flushed. "I forge nothing of value, only experiments for study. My work is legitimate." His voice rose, almost breaking. "Do you think I killed Henry for glass? Madness!" "No," Tuppence said softly, eyes narrowing. "But you know who might have, don't you?" Ambrose licked his lips, then bent back over his papers. "Ask Charles," he muttered. "Ask Clara. Ask anyone but me." It was not an answer, but it was enough to convince the Beresfords he was concealing more than theory. As they stepped into the corridor, they nearly collided with Inspector Graves, who had taken to patrolling the house since dawn. His bulk filled the narrow space, his hat dripping from the morning drizzle, his eyes keen under heavy brows. "Well, well, you two again," he said gruffly. "Always where you shouldn't be. Bad habit." Tommy folded his arms. "We're only following the facts, Inspector. Ambrose knows more than he admits." "Perhaps," Graves said. "And perhaps you'd do well to remember whose case this is. I don't fancy amateurs turning my crime scene into a parlour game." "Parlour games can be instructive," Tuppence replied sweetly. Graves scowled. "Keep your noses out, or you'll answer for obstruction." But his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, even admiration. He had seen their discoveries already carried weight. That evening, as the household prepared for another uneasy dinner, Tuppence took a detour through the west corridor. The lamps here flickered low, the air heavy with the scent of wax and polish. She paused when she heard voices, Lady Eleanor's sharp with agitation, and another softer but urgent, her companion Clara. "You promised me," Lady Eleanor hissed, "never to speak of it again. Not Paris, not what happened there." Clara's reply was muffled, desperate. "But if they find out, Eleanor, if they learn the truth, it will destroy us both." "Better destroyed than exposed," Lady Eleanor's voice shook. "Do you think I can bear another scandal after Reginald's? Paris is buried. It must remain buried." There was the scrape of a chair, hurried footsteps, and silence. Tuppence pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing. Paris. What had happened there? And how did it tie to Reginald's collection, to the mirrors, to death itself? Later, Tuppence recounted the overheard quarrel to Tommy as they sat in their chamber, the candle burning low. "Paris," she repeated. "They spoke as though it were a spectre haunting them. Eleanor terrified, Clara complicit. Whatever it is, it binds them in silence." Tommy frowned. "And Ambrose dabbling in forgery, Charles bribing servants, debts hanging over Henry. It's a tangle of lies. Too many motives, too many secrets." "That," Tuppence said softly, "is exactly what makes it fascinating. Murder thrives in tangle. And the truth, Tommy, truth shows itself most clearly in reflection. We only need the right shard of glass." The hallways of Greyhaven were restless. Servants whispered of ghosts. Candles guttered as though in protest. Somewhere a door creaked slowly on its hinges. Tuppence, unable to sleep, slipped from her chamber and returned once more to the shattered mirror. She held the shard against another surface, watching how it twisted the reflection into something uncanny, almost sinister. Her own face doubled, fragmented, multiplied until it seemed she was surrounded by ghostly versions of herself. In that distorted glass, she thought she glimpsed truths unspoken, betrayal, greed, fear. Then, behind her, came the sound of a footstep. She turned swiftly, but the corridor was empty, or appeared to be. The lies at Greyhaven Hall were deepening. Reflections revealed fragments of truth, but never the whole. And for Tommy and Tuppence, the danger was clear. The murderer understood mirrors too, and knew how to use them to conceal a deadly game. The rain had returned by evening, falling in fine, relentless threads against the high windows of Greyhaven Hall. The sound lent a rhythm to the silence, like a heartbeat muffled by distance. Most of the household had retreated to their rooms after a strained supper, but Tommy lingered in the library, drawn less by books than by the quiet watchfulness of the room itself. The library was vast, lined with shelves that stretched to the ceiling, but it was not the books that interested him. It was the furniture, specifically the large glass-fronted desk that stood in pride of place near the hearth. Its surface gleamed faintly, reflecting both firelight and the man's mind that studied it. Tommy circled it slowly, running a hand along the smooth edge. The drawers seemed ordinary enough, but the craftsmanship was too careful, too deliberate. He crouched, tugged gently at the lowest drawer, and found that it resisted, as though some hidden mechanism held it shut. "Now, what are you concealing?" he murmured. A soft laugh answered him. Tuppence, candle in hand, had slipped into the room as silently as any ghost. "You and drawers, Tommy. I've never known a desk escape your suspicion." He grinned. "A desk that won't open fairly begs for attention. Have a go, old thing." Tuppence set down the candle and knelt beside him, tapping lightly on the wood. Her eyes sparkled with the thrill of the chase. "Here. Do you hear it? Hollow on one side." She pressed delicately, then slid her finger along the groove until there came a faint click. A small panel gave way, revealing a narrow compartment behind the glass. Inside lay a bundle of papers, neatly tied with ribbon, their edges yellowed with time. Tommy whistled softly. Hidden compartments again. Greyhaven positively groans with them. Tuppence untied the ribbon with reverence and spread the letters upon the desk. The handwriting was elegant but inconsistent, as though written in haste. Yet what caught her eye first was the code. Odd arrangements of letters, some reversed, some doubled. "A code," Tommy said grimly. "Can you make sense of it?" "Of course I can," Tuppence said with mock severity. "I once beat you at the Times crossword, did I not?" She studied the first page, her brow furrowing. Slowly she began to murmur aloud, deciphering as she went. "My dearest R, the distance between us is unbearable. Paris holds me, but my heart belongs to Greyhaven. The child thrives. One day he must know his true father, though society would never forgive. Until then, these letters must be my only confession." Tommy drew in a sharp breath. Good Lord. Reginald Harwood and a mistress abroad. A child, too. That would throw the whole inheritance into question. Tuppence turned another letter, her fingers steady though her voice grew hushed. "If they knew in England they would ruin me. Already there are whispers. Burn these letters if you love me." She set it down carefully. "Well, Tommy, this broadens things. If Reginald had a son, he might be the rightful heir. No wonder someone would kill to keep that hidden." Tommy leaned back, arms folded. "Unless the letters themselves are forgeries. The dates here don't align. This one speaks of Paris in the spring, but Reginald was documented in Scotland at the same time. Either he travelled in secret or someone's playing at deception." "Forgery again," Tuppence said softly. "And who better than our scholarly cousin, with his tricks of glass and hidden inks?" They stared at the letters, both sensing how the walls of Greyhaven thickened with intrigue. The house settled into uneasy quiet. Hours later, when the grandfather clock struck midnight, Tuppence found herself restless. She returned to the library alone, candle held high, determined to re-examine the letters. The fire had long since died, leaving the room cold. She moved toward the desk when a faint rustle made her pause. Someone was already there. She lowered the candle, casting its glow across the room. A figure started up from behind the desk, eyes wide and guilty. "Henry," she began, then corrected herself. "No, of course. You." It was Charles, the surviving nephew, his face pale and strained. He held a drawer half open as though caught in theft. "Tuppence," he stammered, "you shouldn't be here." "Nor should you," she replied calmly. "Looking for something?" He ran a hand through his hair, visibly rattled. Yes, proof, that's all. Proof to clear myself." "From what?" "From debts," he said with sudden fierceness. "Henry always held it over me, that I owed him, that he could ruin me. I thought he kept records. If the letters showed he was lying—" "Letters about debts?" Tuppence asked pointedly. "Or about Reginald's affair in Paris?" His eyes flickered in alarm. "You've read them. Enough to know they could destroy more than one reputation. Why do you want them?" Charles hesitated, then sank into the nearest chair, his bravado collapsing. "Because I can't bear it any longer. The debts, the whispers, the suspicion. Henry is dead, and now the inspector looks at me as though I wielded the glass myself. But I swear to you, Mrs. Beresford, I did not kill him. I only sought evidence, anything to defend myself." Tuppence studied him in silence. His desperation seemed genuine, yet his hands trembled too much for her full trust. Still, a confession of weakness was not the same as a confession of murder. "Very well," she said at last. "But you'll leave the letters to us. If you take them, they'll vanish into more lies, and Greyhaven has enough lies already." Reluctantly, Charles nodded. He slipped past her, shoulders hunched, and disappeared into the corridor. When dawn crept pale through the drapes, Tuppence and Tommy reconvened in their chamber, the letters spread between them. Tommy rubbed his chin. If they're genuine, they prove Reginald had an illegitimate child abroad. That child might contest the estate. Plenty of motive for murder to keep the scandal hidden. But if forged, Tuppence countered, then they were planted to mislead. And that too is motive. Someone trying to cast suspicion upon Ambrose, perhaps, or upon Eleanor. And Charles, Tommy said thoughtfully, desperate, entangled in debts. Yet his confession rang true. A man in his position would hardly confess weakness if he were guilty. Unless, Tuppence replied, he confessed weakness precisely to mask guilt. Mirrors and lies, Tommy. Nothing is what it seems. She tapped the letters with one elegant finger. And these may be the greatest lie of all. The rain eased by morning, but the air in Greyhaven Hall was heavier than ever. Hidden compartments, coded correspondence, prowlers in the night. The house seemed to feed on secrets, multiplying them until no truth could be seen clearly. For Tommy and Tuppence, the discovery of the letters had opened a door not just to scandal, but to a labyrinth of deceit. Somewhere within it walked a murderer, cloaked in reflections and lies. The rain had ceased, leaving the grounds of Greyhaven Hall drenched in silvery mist. By afternoon, the air within the house seemed heavier than the fog outside, thick with dread, suspicion, and the lingering scent of lilies from the conservatory where Henry Harwood had met his fate. Tuppence sat in the long hall of mirrors, a notebook on her lap, and a restless gleam in her eye. The mirrors stretched down both sides of the chamber, some tall and gilt-framed, others small and dark, each reflecting shards of light from the scattered candles. To any casual observer, it was a gallery of eccentric vanity. To Tuppence, it was a puzzle. She rose, moving one of the candlesticks closer to a Venetian mirror whose surface was clouded with age. Lifting the triangular shard she had pocketed days before, she held it against the glass. The flame bent oddly, and letters, previously invisible, seemed to shimmer into being at the margin of the mirror. "For now we see," she murmured. She moved the shard slightly. More words revealed themselves, faint yet unmistakable, through a glass, darkly. Her breath caught, a biblical phrase, and perhaps a clue. She quickly tried other mirrors, adjusting their angles, testing reflections. To her growing excitement, fragments of inscriptions appeared here and there, etched faintly and hidden until the shard revealed them. "Tommy!" she called. Her husband appeared, arms folded, sceptical as ever. "What is it this time? More ghostly faces?" "Not faces, words. Look here." She handed him the shard and positioned a second mirror opposite the first. The two reflections bent toward one another, doubling, distorting. Letters leapt into place like a cipher unlocking itself. Tommy squinted. "Speculum veritas, per umbras, mirror truth through shadows." Very poetic. But what does it mean? "It means," Tuppence said triumphantly, "that Reginald Harwood used these mirrors to conceal a message, a code, perhaps instructions leading to something hidden." Tommy gave a low whistle. "Hidden assets, treasure, a legacy." "Something of value," Tuppence replied. "Something worth killing for." They spent an hour experimenting, moving mirrors with the help of nervous servants, aligning shards and reflections until sentences began to form. Some were biblical, some cryptic. The glass remembers. Truth lies fractured. Betrayal hides behind the silver. It was like assembling a mosaic from broken tiles. Slowly, the words pointed toward the notion of a concealed inheritance, something left deliberately for those clever or desperate enough to seek it. Tommy leaned against the wall, wiping his brow. "So, Reginald left riddles in mirrors. Why not a normal will like decent people?" "Because," Tuppence said with a glint, "decent people do not haunt their families with curses." Their discoveries might have continued, but by 4 o'clock Lady Eleanor insisted they all gather for tea in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was brittle, like porcelain threatening to crack. Charles lounged in a chair, his expression bored yet watchful. Ambrose muttered feverishly about mirror worlds as he stirred his cup with unnecessary vigour. Clara sat beside her aunt, attentive, her pale fingers steady on the teapot. Inspector Graves stood near the hearth, glowering as though even tea were a suspicious substance. Tuppence accepted a cup with grace, But her eyes never left Clara, who poured with perfect composure. Lady Eleanor lifted her own cup, her hand trembling. It happened almost at once. Eleanor sipped, gave a sudden gasp, and the cup clattered from her grasp. She choked, colour draining from her face. Clara cried out, leaping to her aid. Tommy was there in an instant, steadying the older woman as she coughed violently. "Get water," he barked. "Quickly!" Tuppence, meanwhile, seized the fallen teacup. She sniffed delicately, then dipped a fingertip and tasted just enough to wrinkle her nose. Bitter, metallic. "Poison," she whispered. The room erupted. Charles swore Ambrose declared it the curse. Mrs. Jessup crossed herself violently, and Graves roared for silence. "Enough," the inspector thundered. "No one leaves this room." Lady Eleanor, pale but recovering, was forced back into her chair, a glass of water pressed to her lips. She shuddered but managed a nod. I'm all right now, only a sip. But it was there. I tasted it." Her eyes darted about the room with horror. One of you tried to kill me." The inspector questioned each in turn, his voice gruff, his pencil scratching. Clara swore she had brewed the tea in the usual way. Mrs. Jessup declared she had fetched the sugar herself. Charles sneered that he had no interest in murdering his aunt. Ambrose muttered that spirits in the mirrors had cursed them all. When Graves turned to the Beresfords, Tommy met his eye steadily. Whoever tried this knew Eleanor would be served first. Poisoning the tea meant intending her death, not chance. Tuppence added softly, "And it means our mirror riddle is not the only legacy in this house. Someone wants to silence Eleanor before she reveals too much." Graves grunted, clearly irritated that the pair saw as much as he did. But the seed was sown. Suspicion hardened, not into certainty, but into terror. Later, when calm had been restored and Lady Eleanor persuaded to rest, Tommy and Tuppence walked the gallery again, their reflections shifting beside them. "She's nearly been killed, Tommy. First Henry, now Eleanor." Tommy's jaw tightened. "And next, perhaps you. This game grows too dangerous." She touched his arm lightly. "Danger is part of the business. But greed, Tommy, that is the real curse here. Not ghosts, not glass. Human greed." He studied her with protective intensity. "Promise me you'll be cautious." "I promise," she said, though her eyes still sparkled with the thrill of discovery. As evening descended, they returned to the mirrors once more, aligning them until the final phrase shimmered faintly into view. "What was broken may yet lead to wholeness. Seek beneath the glass, where shadows meet." Tuppence stared at the words, then whispered, "The curse was never supernatural. It was design. Reginald left instructions hidden in glass, promising treasure or inheritance, and murder followed, not from spirits, but from men and women desperate to possess it." Tommy nodded grimly. "So the glass darkly was never about visions. It was about greed reflected, multiplied, distorted, until it killed." The candlelight wavered across their faces, merging their reflections with the fractured words. Greyhaven's mystery was deepening, but the shape of it was finally clear. It was not a curse. It was human hands, human lies, human hunger. And before it ended, they knew it would claim yet more blood. Greyhaven Hall awoke to yet another morning of tension, the corridors alive with whispers that slithered through cracks in the woodwork like draughts of cold air. The household had hardly recovered from the shock of Lady Eleanor's near poisoning the previous afternoon, when a new cry echoed through the house, shrill, panicked, unmistakably the cry of discovery. It came from the east wing, where Ambrose Harwood, the scholarly cousin, had been given a study filled with his piles of notes and stacks of glassware. Tommy and Tuppence were already descending the stairs when Inspector Graves barreled past, his greatcoat flapping like the wings of a crow. "Stay back," he barked. But Tuppence never had much patience for staying back. She followed with a purposeful stride, Tommy keeping close beside her. Ambrose's study was a chamber of disorder. Books littered the floor, half-burnt candles dripped onto stacks of parchment, and strange contraptions involving lenses and mirrors were scattered like a mad alchemist's toys. At the desk, Ambrose himself slumped lifelessly, his face grey, his glasses askew. Before him lay shards of broken glass, some embedded in his hands, one large piece pressed against his chest. Graves stooped, his grim expression unchanged. Glass again, he muttered. He must have thrust it into himself. Poor devil. One of the servants sobbed at the sight. Lady Eleanor, summoned swiftly, clutched at the doorframe, whispering, "The curse another soul claimed." Tuppence stepped forward, her sharp eyes already searching. She touched Tommy's arm lightly. "Look closely," she whispered. The others might have seen only suicide, but Tuppence saw details. The shard pressed against Ambrose's chest lay neatly across the waistcoat, without the expected tearing of cloth. Blood had spread, but oddly uniform, as though placed rather than spilled. More telling still, the cuts on Ambrose's hands. They were angled for a left-handed man, but Tuppence distinctly remembered Ambrose writing pages of notes with his right hand. She bent lower, studying the floor. The shards glittered in unnaturally straight lines, as though arranged, not scattered by accident. "This is no suicide," she said quietly. Graves turned, his heavy brow furrowing. "What makes you so certain?" "The glass is too tidy," she replied, "and Ambrose was right-handed. These wounds are wrong. Someone staged this scene to look like despair, but despair rarely arranges itself so carefully." Tommy nodded grimly. "So our glass-obsessed scholar has been silenced. Convenient, considering he dabbled in forgeries." Graves grunted, but his eyes betrayed reluctant agreement. By noon the household had gathered in the drawing-room once again, the tension unbearable. Graves questioned each in turn, but their answers were the same blend of fear and evasions. Charles swore he had been walking the grounds. Clara claimed she had been tending to Eleanor. Mrs. Jessup muttered darkly that the devil takes those who meddle in shadows. At last, when the others had dispersed, Graves drew Tommy and Tuppence aside. "I'll admit it plain," he said, his voice low. "This case is beyond the reach of straightforward police work. Too many riddles, too many secrets in this house. You two seem to have a knack for stirring them out." Tuppence raised her brows with mock modesty. "You mean you want us to meddle?" "I mean," Graves said gruffly, "that if you've any theories, I'll hear them. I'll not have another death on my hands." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence, who smiled faintly. "We'll do more than give you theories, Inspector. We'll give you the truth." That evening they walked the gallery once more, reflections flickering beside them. Each suspect loomed larger in their thoughts. "Charles, with his debts," Tommy said. "Desperate men kill for less." "Clara, with her loyalty to Eleanor," Tuppence countered. "And the quarrel I overheard about Paris. She hides something vital." "And Eleanor herself," Tommy added reluctantly. "Her obsession with the mirrors, her terror of losing them. People cling to relics with dangerous strength." "And Mrs. Jessup," Tuppence said. "She knows the servants' gossip, and she's been watching far too closely. Never underestimate a housekeeper." They paused before one of the great mirrors, its cloudy surface reflecting their troubled faces. "Ambrose's death makes no sense unless he knew something," Tuppence murmured. "Perhaps about the coded inscriptions, or the letters, or the child in Paris." Someone silenced him before he spoke. Tommy's hand tightened on hers. "Then we must force them to speak." That night, the mood in Greyhaven was worse than ever. Servants refused to pass through corridors alone. Candles guttered in draughts, their flames trembling like frightened hearts. The mirrors themselves seemed to brood, their distorted reflections catching every glance. Lady Eleanor dined in silence, Clara hovering protectively. Charles drank more than his share of brandy, his hands shaking as he lifted the glass. Graves prowled the edges of the room like a restless hound. Tuppence studied them all, her eyes bright with resolve. The air was thick with lies, but she had begun to trace the pattern of truth within them. As the clock struck 11, she rose. "Enough," she said softly to Tommy. "Tomorrow we hold a confrontation. One way or another, the truth will come out." The grand hall of mirrors had never looked so ominous. Candles blazed in every sconce, their flames quivering in the draughty air, multiplying endlessly in the glass, until it seemed an army of lights stared down at the assembled company. The great chandelier trembled overhead, casting shards of brilliance across the floor. Into this glittering chamber Tommy and Tuppence gathered the household. One by one they came, Charles pale and restless, his eyes darting, Clara quiet as ever, her lips pressed tight, Lady Eleanor regal in her grief but trembling at the edges, Mrs. Jessup grim and defiant, And finally Inspector Graves, arms folded, his gaze sceptical yet intent. Behind Lady Eleanor hovered her constant shadow, her companion, Miss Clara Staines, so attentive, so unobtrusive, almost invisible until one truly looked. Tuppence, standing at the centre, felt the weight of their eyes. She placed the triangular shard of glass on the table beside her and folded her hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm, "it is time we set aside curses and shadows. The truth lies not in superstition, but in simple human greed." A murmur rippled through the room. Tuppence walked slowly to the shattered frame of the great Venetian mirror, propped against the wall like the corpse of a giant. "The first act in this play was here," she said. "The mirror was not broken by accident. It was smashed deliberately to provide distraction while someone attempted the lock of the cabinet that housed Reginald Harwood's collection." She turned, her eyes sweeping the group. But even then the destruction was clever. A shard was taken, not at random, but because it was etched with part of the code Reginald left behind. A code that, when assembled, points towards something hidden. Lady Eleanor gave a strangled whisper. "His legacy." "Yes," Tuppence said. "But more than legacy, proof. Proof of scandal, of betrayal, of a child who might have claimed Greyhaven itself. Someone wanted to suppress that proof, someone willing to kill to keep it hidden." Tommy stepped forward now, his tone brisk. "We were meant to be misled at every turn. A glove stained with blood, tucked beneath a chair. Too obvious, too neat. A planted clue to point suspicion at one person, Charles perhaps with his debts, or Henry, before his death." Charles flushed angrily, but Tommy's gaze held him steady. "Then came the letters," Tuppence continued, lifting the bundle they had found. "They spoke of an affair abroad, a child hidden, a scandal waiting to erupt. Genuine, perhaps, but the dates do not align. They are forgeries, crafted to broaden the field of suspects, to entangle us all in false trails." Ambrose's name hung unspoken, his skill in glass, his dabbling in forgeries, but he was already beyond defending himself. "And so," Tuppence said softly, "the letters became a red herring, like the glove, tools of misdirection." Inspector Graves shifted impatiently. "And what of the deaths? Speak plain, Mrs. Beresford." "Plainly, then," Tuppence replied. "Henry was the first, found with glass in his throat. But he did not fall. He was pushed. Ambrose was the second, staged to look like suicide. But he was silenced because he knew too much. And Lady Eleanor herself nearly became the third, poisoned at tea." Gasps rippled through the hall. Lady Eleanor swayed where she stood. Clara gripped her arm quickly, too quickly, as though fearing the truth might topple them both. "Yes," Tuppence said, her eyes narrowing. "The attempt on Eleanor revealed the hand behind it all, because only someone close, someone trusted, could have prepared her cup." She turned back to the table and lifted the triangular shard. Its edges caught the candlelight, scattering it in brilliant fragments. "This," she said, "is the key. When placed against another mirror, it reveals words invisible before, words that do not speak of curses but of greed and betrayal. And when I fitted it back into the broken Venetian mirror, its reflection pointed, not at chance, not at superstition, but directly at the true culprit." The room was utterly silent. Even the inspector held his breath. Tuppence raised her arm and pointed. "You, Miss Staines, the loyal companion, the silent shadow." Clara Staines froze, her hand still gripping Lady Eleanor's arm, her face drained of colour. "You played the part perfectly," Tuppence said, her voice steady. "Always attentive, always quiet, never drawing notice. But you had the most to gain. You knew of the affair in Paris. You knew of the possibility of a child who might claim the estate. And you used that knowledge to blackmail Eleanor, keeping her silent. When Henry threatened to expose you, he died. When Ambrose uncovered the forgeries, he died too. And when Eleanor herself grew too fearful, you tried to poison her." "No!" Eleanor gasped, turning to her companion. "Tell them it isn't true. Tell them!" But Miss Staines's eyes had hardened. The mask of gentleness slipped, revealing the steel beneath. "They would have ruined you," she hissed. "All of them. Eleanor, you would have lost everything. I did what had to be done." "You killed for it," Tuppence said. Miss Staines straightened, her voice low and cold. "And I would kill again. With sudden violence, she seized a heavy candlestick from the table and hurled it against the nearest mirror. Glass exploded outward, shards raining down like deadly rain. The reflections splintered into chaos, 100 broken faces staring from every direction. Lady Eleanor screamed. Charles ducked. Graves lunged forward, but Miss Staines had already snatched another candlestick, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" she cried. Her eyes were wild, glittering with desperate fury. "Do you think I'll be paraded like a criminal? No, I'll end this house of lies myself." She swung at another mirror, the crash deafening, glass skittering across the floor. For an instant it seemed she might bring the entire hall down in glittering ruin. But Tommy moved swiftly, seizing her wrist from behind with the practiced grip of an old soldier. She struggled, clawing, shrieking, but he held firm. Graves closed in, wrenching the candlestick from her grasp. Miss Staines sagged at last, the fight draining from her, her chest heaving. The hall of mirrors stood in wreckage, candlelight fractured into 1,000 jagged points. Graves snapped orders, the servants scurrying to clear the shards. Miss Staines was led away, her face pale but unrepentant. Lady Eleanor wept silently, her hands shaking as she clutched a handkerchief. Tuppence stood amid the ruins, her gaze softening. It was never a curse, only human greed, reflected and multiplied until it destroyed everything it touched. Tommy rested a hand on her shoulder. "And broken mirrors," he said quietly, "make poor guardians of truth." The candle flames guttered in the draught, their reflections now fewer, their brilliance diminished. But the danger had passed. The truth, at last, was whole. The hall of mirrors, once dazzling with candlelight, lay in shambles. Shards glittered across the floor like fallen stars, the fractured faces of the Harwood legacy staring blankly from broken glass. Servants crept in with dustpans and heavy gloves, sweeping carefully, while the family lingered in shock. Miss Staines had been taken away under guard, her expression still cold, defiant, and unrepentant. Lady Eleanor remained seated in a carved chair at the far end of the hall, her hands clutching a lace handkerchief, her shoulders bowed with an exhaustion beyond years. Inspector Graves, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the case had ground into his skull, finally turned to the Beresfords. His voice carried a mixture of reluctance and gruff sincerity. "Well, I'll not deny it," he said. "You've done the work I could not. You saw the threads in the glass, where I saw only shards. Credit where it's due, though it pains me to say so." Tommy offered a small bow. "Coming from you, Inspector, that's practically a standing ovation." Graves scowled, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Tuppence, crouched by one of the broken mirrors, lifted a fragment delicately and studied how the flame of a candle bent through it. "Mirrors never show us the truth," she murmured. "Only versions. Distorted, reversed, incomplete. People are the same, Inspector. That's why it took so long to find the real face behind the glass." Later, in the library where the fire still burned low, the Beresfords spread their notes across the desk. Graves leaned against the mantel, arms folded, watching them like a schoolmaster tolerating clever pupils. Tommy tapped the bundle of coded letters. "So, these caused half the trouble, but in the end, they were never about inheritance, were they?" Tuppence shook her head. "No, the affair was real enough. Reginald Harwood's weakness in Paris, a woman who bore him a child. But the child died in infancy, years ago. The letters speak of a claim that never came to pass. Miss Staines knew this, but she used them to stoke fear, to keep Eleanor in her grasp. They became her lever of blackmail." Graves grunted. "So the scandal was smoke without fire." "Oh, there was fire once," Tuppence replied, "but it burned out long before. Only ashes remained. And Miss Staines fanned those ashes into something larger, something she could use." Tommy leaned back, thoughtful. "Which explains why Ambrose had to die. He saw the inconsistencies in the letters, knew they could not be genuine. He might have exposed her. So she arranged his death, dressing it as despair." Graves rubbed his jaw. "And Henry, the soldier cousin, what of him?" "Henry was inconvenient," Tuppence said quietly. "He boasted too much, threatened too openly. Miss Staines pushed him into the glass, perhaps with more violence than she intended. After that, she had to continue. Murder begets murder. Lady Eleanor entered then, supported by Mrs. Jessup. She looked diminished, her usual command of the room dissolved into fragility. She sank into a chair by the fire, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I lived too long with illusions," she said. "I thought my husband's collection a legacy, a shield against the world. I thought my household united by blood, by loyalty. But mirrors are liars, Mrs. Beresford. They show beauty where there is only vanity, unity where there is only fracture. And I, foolish woman, believed them." Tuppence rose and went to her, gently taking her hand. "You were deceived, Lady Eleanor, as many are. Deception thrives best where love and trust already dwell. But you see the truth now. That is what matters." Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes. Truth, at such cost. Tommy spoke gently. Costly, yes, but lies left to grow are costlier still. Better that truth came at last. Inspector Graves straightened, tugging at his coat. "I'll see to the formalities. Miss Staines will face the law. Her skill was silence, but the law has a louder voice." He glanced once more at the Beresfords. "I'll not make a habit of it, mind, but if ever I'm trapped in another house of shadows, I'll not turn you away." Tommy smiled faintly. A recommendation from Inspector Graves. Tuppence, we should frame it. Tuppence's eyes danced. "Better not in glass, Tommy. We've had quite enough of mirrors for one lifetime." Graves snorted and departed, heavy steps echoing down the corridor. When the household at last retired, Tommy and Tuppence lingered alone in the drawing-room. The storm had passed outside, leaving the night clear and star-pricked, but inside Greyhaven the air still smelled faintly of dust and shattered silvering. Tuppence leaned against the mantel, her expression thoughtful. "It's curious, isn't it? How much we trust mirrors. Every morning we look into them for reassurance, for truth of our own faces. And yet they are always backwards, always a lie." Tommy stretched in his chair, eyes half closed. "Perhaps that's why people like them. A lie is often easier to look at than the truth." She studied him, smiling faintly. "Oh, Tommy, always the philosopher when you're tired." "And you," he replied, "always the detective when you're restless. Admit it, you're thinking about the missing shard, the words hidden in the glass." "Of course I am," she said softly. It was Reginald's last jest, his legacy. He knew his family would fight over mirrors and shadows, but in the end, it was not the mirrors that mattered, but the people who stared into them, and they showed themselves in all their flaws. At last, Tuppence gathered the letters, the notes, the fragments, and tied them together with the ribbon once more. She placed them in the desk and closed the drawer firmly. "No more secrets," she said. "Let Greyhaven heal." Tommy rose, offering her his arm. "Come along then, partner in crime. We've earned our rest." As they left the room, the last candle flickered, casting one final reflection in the cracked glass above the mantel. Two figures walked side by side, distorted, reversed, but together still, and in that fractured reflection lay the truest image of all. The journey back from Greyhaven Hall was undertaken in silence, save for the steady hum of the motor car and the occasional protest from a muddy lane. Outside, the countryside looked freshly washed after so many days of storm. Fields lay green and gleaming, hedgerows sparkled with raindrops, and the air had that curious crispness of renewal, as though nature had conspired to sweep away the dust of human cruelty. Tommy, at the wheel, hunched forward in his overcoat, his expression serious. Tuppence sat beside him, a scarf wound tightly round her throat, her eyes distant with thought. Neither spoke much until the familiar spires of their own village came into view, small and unassuming after the brooding grandeur of Greyhaven. When at last they reached home, a modest house with cheerful curtains and a garden that looked none the worse for neglect, they stepped inside with a sigh of relief. The air was warm, the furniture homely, and there was a waiting sense of safety that no hall of mirrors could ever rival. "Put the kettle on, Tommy," Tuppence said, already shedding her gloves. "If we've earned anything, it's a proper cup of tea." The kitchen was soon filled with the comfortable hiss of boiling water and the fragrance of fresh leaves. Tuppence busied herself with the cups and saucers while Tommy produced a plate of biscuits from the cupboard, somewhat worse for wear but still edible. They carried the tray to the sitting room and settled before the fire, the flames dancing merrily as though celebrating their safe return. Tuppence curled into her chair, cradling her cup with both hands. "Well," she said at last, "that was an adventure. Storms, murders, betrayals, secret letters and broken mirrors, all very gothic. I'm not sure I've quite recovered." Tommy stretched his legs toward the fire. "I've decided country houses should come with warning signs. Beware. May contain death, scandal, and suspicious relatives." She laughed, a warm sound that cut through the lingering shadows. "You must admit, Tommy, you missed some very obvious things. The blood-stained glove, for example. It practically shouted red herring, yet you were ready to take it at face value." He sipped his tea with dignity. One mustn't dismiss evidence too lightly. A glove is a glove, after all. "And planted evidence is planted evidence," she retorted. "If you had your way, we'd have arrested Charles on the spot and left Miss Staines to brew us all poisoned tea." Tommy smiled faintly. "That's what you're for, to rescue me from my own common sense." Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Tuppence grew thoughtful again. "It troubles me, though, how easily people see what they want to see. Lady Eleanor believed in loyalty, in her family's unity, even when it crumbled around her. Miss Staines hid behind devotion, and no one looked twice. And those mirrors, they gave the perfect metaphor. Reflections, distortions, fragments, through the glass, darkly indeed." Tommy nodded slowly. "People don't often want truth. They want reassurance. Mirrors flatter, lies comfort, and when the truth finally does show itself, it's often too late." She glanced at him over the rim of her cup. "Philosophy again, Tommy. You should take it up as a profession." "I prefer something safer," he said dryly, "like chasing murderers through draughty corridors." Tuppence leaned back, her eyes sparkling once more. "I must admit, though, you handled Miss Staines rather well. Very heroic, seizing her arm like that. You might have stepped straight out of one of those detective novels." "Heroics are all very well," Tommy said modestly, "but it was you who spotted the truth. I was still fumbling about with shards of glass while you pointed straight to the villain." She smiled. "Partnership, Tommy. You catch arms, I catch lies. Between us we muddle through." "Not muddle," he corrected. "Shine, Tuppence, always shine." For a moment their eyes met, and the shadows of Greyhaven seemed to dissolve, leaving only the warmth of their firelit room. Tuppence set down her empty cup with a decisive clink. "Well, we've survived another case. I dare say we shall soon be back to gardening, reading, and, oh yes, paying bills." She reached for her knitting basket, the same half-finished project she had abandoned the night the letter arrived. "And perhaps," she said with a wry smile, "I shall even manage more than 2 rows at last." Tommy groaned. "Bills. I'd almost prefer another haunted house." "Careful what you wish for," she said with a laugh. "Mysteries have a way of finding us whether we invite them or not." He leaned back with a sigh. "Then let them come, so long as we face them together." Tuppence reached across and patted his hand. "That, Tommy dear, is the only truth a mirror can never distort." Outside, the night deepened softly, peaceful and untroubled. Within, the Beresfords sat side by side, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. The world might be perilous, distorted, and filled with shadows, but in this small corner of it, light prevailed. And so, with tea, wit, and companionship, another mystery drew to its close.